So I am very, very pleased to have Michael Twitty with us tonight. He is a living history interpreter, culinary historian, and food writer who teaches, documents, and preserves African American culinary tradition. He has appeared on a number of culinary shows, the two most recent being Michelle Obama's Waffles and Mochi and High on the Hog, both on Netflix. In 2017, Mr. Twitty released his book, The Cooking Gene, which traces his ancestry through food from West and Central Africa to America and from slavery to freedom. In 2018, The Cooking Gene won the James Beard Award for Best Writing and for Book of the Year, making him the first Black author to be awarded. In 2019, he was once again nominated for a James Beard Award for his piece on visiting Ghana, which was published in Bon Appetit. His most recent book, Rice, was just recently released in February of this year, and Kosher Soul, which is about his culinary journey as a Jew of African descent, will be out in 2022. So now I will stop sharing my screen here and turn it over to Mr. Twitty.
Hi, everybody. I am so excited to be here. And I miss visiting Texas. I was actually in Texas in the January of 2020. And I'd just come back from Sierra Leone. And I mean, when I say just come back, I went from Sierra Leone to Paris, from Sierra Leone to Guinea, Guinea, West Africa to Paris, Paris to Dulles, Dulles to Dallas, Dallas to Austin. And so I was in rare form when I got up the next day and gave another version of this talk. But I'm much more grounded now, even though I'm in the middle of a move. My roots also have a Texas component. My great-great-great-grandfather, who was not Black, lived in Texas, and that's where I have family that is in Panola County. And so that's part of our family story, actually, that we found out many years later, probably through half my life. And I think it's important to remind people that everybody wants to talk about Juneteenth now, but I would hope that this discussion of Juneteenth will lead to more discussion of what the afro-Texan experience has been and how important it is and how unique it is in the story of the food and culture of Black people in the New World. You know, we talk about having an Afro-Atlantic, an African Atlantic. That name may not be familiar to some of you, but it's a term that we use to embrace all of the cultures in the Atlantic Basin that are based in African people, cultures, and identities, no matter if they're in Europe, in Africa, in North or South America. And of course, there are other connections across the globe. But I guess what we're getting at is, how do we go from the world of Texas food to the cities and villages and farms and rivers and forests of West Africa? And that, for me, has been a lifelong journey. It's not a difficult question to answer, but it can often be daunting to present that to people. So let me just knock out a few facts here. So before, there's been the presence of people of African descent in Texas since the 1500s, and even more so in the 18th and 19th and 20th and 21st centuries. The Texas Black population is one of the most diverse in origin. About 60+% during the antebellum period came from the lower South. So in other words, people who had originally, been born in South Carolina, Georgia, and then Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, southern parts of Arkansas and Florida, were pushing west. And, there was this thing about fever. So first it was the Georgia fever, then it was the Alabama fever, then it was the Mississippi fever, and then it was the Louisiana fever, and then it was the Texas fever. And the Texas fever was was in many ways more potent than any of the rest, because Texas was huge. There was this huge landmass. There was this rush after Texas ratified statehood after its year of independence, and there was all this land that was being taken from the indigenous people, and was removed from the governance of Mexico. And a lot of the eastern part of Texas um, was prime for cotton, and then in coastal Texas, sugarcane and rice, but especially cotton. And Tennessee, known as the grandfather of Texas, represents the upper South. The upper South was about 30%. So we're talking about enslaved people. Notice I say enslaved and not slave, because one is a condition, the other one is an identity. Please get it right. We're talking about enslaved people and slaveholders and other settlers and yeoman farmers coming west. And they are coming to Northeast Texas, mostly from the upper South, and in the deep east and lower part of Texas near the coast, mostly from the lower South. And that's important because, these folks who came over had very specific origins. We know that Texas had a large cultural impact, influence, and settlement from Mexico and the Spanish. But we also know that there were Germans and Czechs and Irish folks there as well. And every one of these populations impacts the food. The food is not just there by accident. The food is a product of all of these different cultures interacting. Now we talk about the Black culture, the African American culture, the afro-Texan culture. We're not talking about a one block. We are talking about a diverse group of people. So, for example, if your ancestors came, for example, from Virginia, there's a 60% chance that they had roots in what is now Nigeria and Cameroon. A lot of the slave trade to Virginia came from a relatively small area, and that impacted who was in Virginia and what DNA they passed on, and also what culture they passed on and what attitudes towards this exile they passed on. In the same way, if you were from South Carolina, to have Congo and Angola roots, to have Sierra Leonean roots and Liberian roots. And when I say these names of these countries, please understand that I understand that these are contemporary names for pieces of land that did not have that name on an indigenous basis, or these country borderlines did not exist in the 18th and 19th century. So what we're really talking about is the Yam people in Nigeria and Cameroon, and the rice people in Senegal and Sierra Leone, and then cassava and millet and corn people in Central Africa. And these things will have long-term impacts on the way people eat, the way they feel about food, the food that makes them feel whole. It's no joke that if you've ever known people from sub-Saharan Africa, they will go out and eat the same food that they eat at home in a restaurant, because nothing else makes them feel full and whole and in a situation where things are hospitable and the table is bountiful. You have to have that same kind of like fullness that one gets from eating yam, fufu, or rice. So you ask the question, what is African food? Well, African food is actually both really diverse and really similar. It has a baseline. So for example, in East Africa, they used to do a lot of millet and sorghum and other crops, but cassava and corn came in, and so you'll see a lot of maize, corn-based dishes like posho and sadza. Think of them as basically grits. They're not quite the same texture, but pretty much it's grits. That's what we're talking about here, all the way down to Mozambique. And then on the west side, you have a mixture of corn, yams, cassava, millet, and sorghum, from Senegal all the way down to Angola, and the other favorite, rice. So if you think about already thinking about the Texas diet and culture of food, we're already in the space of rice and of corn, two of the biggest staples. And we're also in the space of sweet potatoes, another favorite. And not to be outdone, there's also okra, black-eyed peas, watermelon, muskmelon, um, lots of hot peppers, lots of tomatoes, onions being common in the diet. And Africa was at the center over a period of millennia of delivery of foods from other parts of the world through trade, through migration, through war, through enslavement. And what's really critical to know is that Africa was not a starving continent before colonization. Um, Colonization for Africa does not really begin in earnest until the middle of the 19th century. And during the middle of the 19th century, you have people like King Leopold who say, "You can't go to your farm. You have to go tap rubber for me. I don't care if you starve." And that's exactly what started happening. And when Africa was divided up by the Berlin Congress in the 1880s, one of the things that happened was the instability of Africans to have subsistence agriculture. So if you ever wonder why those commercials make Africa look so desolate, well, that's the consequence of 100 years of corruption, of colonialism, and other things which are beyond unfortunate, which are soul killing. But to go back to the Africa of 1500 to 1800, or not even 1850, what we're talking about is 2,000 indigenous food plants, including domesticated plants in Africa. So everything, millet and sorghum, which grow much like corn, have very similar uses, are going to be paired with corn in terms of the diet. Difference is that millet and sorghum might give you one crop. Maize or corn gives you two in most of tropical Africa, if not three. So these crops from the Americas that were brought through the Spanish and Portuguese, and some people have strongly suggested before the Columbian period, there was some exchange of plants between Africa and America. Um, you have a whole revolution in the food. And this is the part that I really want to stress for people tonight. The food leads you on the path of the people. So, for example, if there's more food in Europe and in Asia and in Africa, because potatoes and corn and sweet potatoes and other foods are being adopted, there is a population boom. Okay. So, the population boom, hi, Marla, Texas. The population boom that you get also foments um, elements of war, of famine, all the big migration, all the big things. So, for example, the potato goes to Ireland from South America as a result of being brought to Europe, being grown in cool climates. Europe was going through the little ice age at the time. So the potato was actually a lifesaver because some of the other crops like barley and wheat, etc., weren't always thriving during this period of subdued temperatures. Europe was colder than it had been for a long time, and the little ice age stretched across North America, Europe, and Eurasia until the beginning of the 18th century. And at that time, potatoes were a godsend to Central and Eastern Europe, and they were a godsend to Ireland and the British Isles. And so, because of that, that leads to the lumper being grown en masse, which is a high producing potato. But when the lumper, as we say in the South, caught sick, and there was a blight on that particular variety, which was monocultured across Ireland, it led to starvation, famine, and then eventually the mass migration of millions of Irish across the globe to mostly English speaking countries. So that's the European version. The African version goes like this. So the slave trade was not in en masse black on black crime. The slave trade was actually the exchange of elites, African elites to African elites, and African elites to European elites, and to Arab elites, trading human beings. And at first, it was almost seen as unnecessary and rather ridiculous. But after the Americas are opened up, this trade in human beings is extremely economically potent. It becomes the most valuable thing that the Western world has, is the free labor of African people, and also their knowledge. That's the point that gets lost: agency and ownership. So even before we hit the shores of Galveston, what we're talking about is people who knew how to grow rice and who had 200 years of experience with corn before they were even in America. People who were miners, people who were cattlemen, And remember I said that, cattlemen, and other blacksmiths and other skills. They were architects. Um, they weren't the version of Africa that I think is still bandied about as being backwards. Actually, these folks who were from Yoruba country, which contributed a lot to the Texas population through Cuba and through Louisiana. They lived in cities for centuries. In fact, Yoruba cities prior to 1600 had more people, had more infrastructure than London ever had up to that point. And queen mothers who built gigantic walls and planned streets. So we're not talking about the same world. We're talking about two different, very different spaces. To say that is to say that these Africans who would come to the American South and the Caribbean and Brazil, Haiti, and other places had a lot of knowledge and ability and skill that was used in the building of the Americas. And Texas was no different. Of course, Texas slavery evolves over a period of centuries. And the people who were bringing elements of their culture from, say, for example, the Carolina, Georgia Low Country, or the Chesapeake, which were the hearth areas of American slavery. When people think about enslavement, they think about Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, other states, excuse me. But the reality is those places were just barely settled at the time of the Civil War. So a lot of culture was being developed for at least 2 centuries on the southeastern seaboard and on the Gulf Coast. We cannot forget about the Gulf Coast as well, because Louisiana and its neighbors also contributed to the flow of culture and ideas to Texas. What's really powerful when you read research by T. Lindsay Baker, hi T. Lindsay Baker if you're out there, and other researchers, is that when you go through the WPA narratives, the WPA narratives were a collection of interviews done by the Works Projects Administration in the 1930s. And what was important about that was they were collecting the interviews of formerly enslaved African Americans who were probably young people, children, teenagers, right before the Civil War, and some were actually quite superannuated. And so they were elders who had lived at least 25 years of their life enslaved and had seen and heard a lot of things and had talked to their elders and their elders' elders. So these interviews that are being done, that are coming from the Texas interviewees, are fascinating and amazing. Some of them are available on the internet through the Library of Congress website. So I really strongly encourage you to read them for yourselves. But from that, we get this amazing set of ideas about the food. Now, before I talk about that last part, which is really critical, and I know you're going to ask a lot of questions, it's important to understand that there were dietary patterns that were established long before people hit Texas. So if you know Northeast Texas, for example, you're talking about a place where they grew cotton, sometimes a little tobacco, a lot of corn, a lot of grain. So Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, that's what they did. So if you ever heard, if you're from Northeast Texas and there's a lot of country ham and all those good things and turnip greens and corn dodgers and other things of that nature, there's a reason for that. That all came wholesale from the upper South and the Chesapeake. If you're from a part of Texas where rice and black-eyed peas and other foods and okra and other things are really important, the chances are that those foods come by way of the lower South, the Low Country in particular. And so that's what people did. They brought those foods with them, but those foods ultimately came from places in West Africa. So Texas also has an illicit trade in human beings coming out of the Caribbean, coming out of Cuba in particular. And let's talk about that for a second, because people don't realize the United States said no more slave trade after 1808. And that was sort of true. But the reality is thousands of people come in illegally by way of slave traders. So some of you may know the story of the Clotilda in Mobile, Alabama, for example, which people are being brought in as late as 1858, 1859, right before the Civil War begins. I mean, can you imagine? The trade is illegal. You don't know the trade's illegal. You don't know what circumstances you've been put in, and after to some level of protexia against enslavement, whether it was in Brazil or other places, now you've been caught up in the system. You've been caught up in the system that you never thought you'd be caught up in. And you land in exile in Alabama. Well, people were being brought to Texas just like that. And a lot of them, ladies and gentlemen, were either from Congo or from the Yoruba people and their neighbors. And so I remember Robert Ferris Thompson, one of our greatest scholars of the Afro-Atlantic tradition and history, talks about those are the big two. And that's because in Brazil, in Cuba, in Haiti, and other places, in Jamaica, the Yoruba and Congo cultures are loom large. Excuse me. I happen to be part Yoruba and Congo. But the Yoruba were not a particularly large group brought to the United States. Now, there are a lot of Yoruba who were brought to to Louisiana, to the Gulf Coast, some parts of South Carolina. But the Yoruba hotspot is Texas. And by the way, those of you who know there's a large Nigerian population today in Texas, I'm sure that some parts of that community don't even know that the Yoruba population and what would be the Nigerian population brought to Texas. If you come from a Texas family and you have twins in the family, Black Texas family, we need to talk because the Yoruba have the largest number of twinning in the population in the world. And the part of the reason why they have the largest number of twins in their birth rate is because, guess what? The guinea yam that the women were eating promotes twinning infertility. So I've noticed, I often ask Black twins, I said, well, do you happen to have any roots in Texas? 8 times out of 10, they'll say, yep. And I say, uh-huh. So do you come from this place, this place? They say, how did you know? And I said, your ancestors were Yoruba from Nigeria. Because the Yoruba and the Igbos have the largest numbers of twinning because of the guinea yam that's in the diet. And food is really, oh yes, I forgot to tell you, you might want to know this. In the Yoruba culture, twins are considered to be an incredible blessing. In fact, if you have twins and one of them, unfortunately, God forbid, passes away, the other twin and the mother will carry around like a little statue of that twin, and everything happens to the living twin happens to the twin in effigy. But it's the most sacred relationship in the Yoruba culture is between twins, and there's even a particular orisha or deity that watches over the twins. But to the extent that food plays a role in all of these things is so critical. For example, we talked about the cattlemen for a second. The cattlemen are the original cattlemen in the South were largely Fulani and their neighbors, and Fulani and people who were related to the Fulani. So the Fulani are another ethnic group that I have ethnicity from. And the Fulani range their cattle all the way from Senegal to what is now the Sudan. So if you can imagine someone ranging their cattle in transhumanists all the way from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. for millennia. That's what we're talking about. They're one of the oldest cattle raising societies in the world. And Africa has not yet been given full credit for its role in cattle domestication and production. But trust me when I tell you, when I went to Senegal and I had my first glance of the Fulani cattlemen and the boys ranging the cattle and the goats in the savannah, it was the most thrilling thing I'd ever seen. Because here I was with this culture that I've always learned about, that I learned was part of my body, my soul, my ancestors, and they were out there with the cattle, and all I could do not to jump out of the car and help them herding the cattle. And when one anthropologist theorized that when you talk about the term cowboy, even 1/3 of the cowboys we know were of African descent. And especially in South Carolina and other places in the lower South, the piney woods, Who do you think was raising those cattle? Black folks. What black folks? Black folks from the Fulani culture, because their slaveholders did know that some enslaved Africans were better at rice, some were better at cattle, some were better at mining and blacksmithing, and they utilized that knowledge um, heavily. And so we can talk about the cowboy like the houseboy. The cowboy was the cattleman of Fulani. The cattle weren't just something they did; it was part of their spirituality, their culture. So we have, I can say we now, Pulaku. Pulaku is the Fulani way, and it's based on the ethics and morals of being a cattleman. And so this whole cowboy way wasn't nothing, it had nothing to do with John Wayne and all them and all the people in the movies. It had everything to do with this earlier culture of African cattlemen from Senegambia, and also the Vaquero culture and Mexican culture. Because we can't forget that Mexican culture is there also, but also the Mexican culture is a tripartite culture of a native, European, and African. And some of those same African roots, that same red rice that y'all be eating, what you call Spanish rice, ain't nothing Spanish about it. That is West African rice. That is jollof rice that's like, taking a slight whitewash. That's what that is. And those of you who know jollof rice, you know that is the transnational West African dish and very important to the culture. Something I make red rice and jollof rice, and they're both central to my kitchen. And it's so critical. I mean, people eat okra, they eat okra pickles, and they eat fried okra and okra soup and gumbo, and they don't realize that what they're eating is wholesale. I mean, okra was found in all of the places that were central to the transatlantic slave trade. So in Senegambia, they call it kanja or kanjo. Kanja is Wolof and Fula. Kanjo is Manding, so Mandinka. Black eyed peas are called Nyebe in Wolof and Fula. They're called Soso in Manding. So all the cultures have these words. In Nigeria, it's called Okuru. Sound familiar? Okuru, okro. In Ghana, it's called Nkrumah. In Eve, in Ghana, it's called Fetsi. And in their neighboring cousins, the Fon, in Benin, it's called Fevi. And in Congo, Angola, it's called Ochingombo or Kingombo. So you know the word gumbo. So all of those words come to and survive the traumas of the trade and enter the English of the American South. Okay. So we also have sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes and yams are different plants, but the sweet potato that was grown and eaten and savored was not the same back then. A lot of times they were people who favored yellow and white sweet potatoes, which, by the way, although there's a slight different consistency and flavor, they're not as beta carotene heavy and sweet as the ones that we've gotten used to, Georgia Jets and Beauregards. But the original versions were called Spanish potatoes because they're from the West Indies. But remember, these already gone over to West Africa before they came back on slave ships to the American South. So the taste would not have been quite. If you've ever had white sweet potatoes, particularly the starchier ones, or even the Japanese sweet potato, which has the red skin, that's closer to what kind of sweet potatoes enslaved people were eating. And then for them, this was the most apt substitute for the yam that you eat in West Africa, even though they look differently. And even the word yam means two things. Yam means to eat. Nyambi in Wolof means the thing you eat, and it refers to sweet potatoes and cassava because sweet cassava has a very similar appearance to this red-skinned, white-fleshed tuber. So it was kind of like, what's that? Like in the Bible, it says mana. Mana is not a thing. Mana literally means what is that stuff? So the same thing with nyambi. What is it? It's a thing you eat. So that's the part of the confusion. But also nyam means to eat. So for example, in American English, we could, what's the word? Somebody texted, somebody put in the chat. What's the word in American English when something tastes good? What is it? What do we teach kids to say? The food tastes what? Yummy, exactly. So Think about this. The word in Jamaica for in patois to eat yam. The word in Gullah Geechee, yam. The word in Senegambia, yam. So you can imagine these women of Senegambian descent who were primarily picked to work in the household to cook. They're telling these white children, who they're raising, and also our kids, yum yum, eat up, yum yum. So the child who is not hearing the NY sound, it's the Y sound, because it's not present in Indo-European languages, is going, oh, yum, 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 yummy. See, words like that don't make it into the American dictionary or American English dictionaries the same way because they go origin unknown. Anytime they say origin unknown, they're talking about Black folks. And that's us. That's our history. One other important element of food I want to talk about is the frying of food, deep frying of food, which is very West African and Middle Eastern, and also barbecue. I ain't gonna look. I'm gonna tell you right quick. Barbecue was about the brothers, not the bubbas. Flat out, point blank. I know people have tried to obfuscate, but I'm sorry, but I've been to Switzerland. I've been to German Switzerland. There's no barbecue there. I've been to England. Mm-mm. I've been to Scandinavia. Mm-mm. Went to Italy. Mm-mm. Nope. I've been to France, up and down, southern France, northern France, Paris, the Bordeaux country. I'm sorry, but I've been to West Africa where they roast meat and fish on the corner. Sound familiar? Especially when they roast that whole pig and that whole lamb and that whole cow. In Cameroon, I had the best Texas barbecue I ever had, and I wasn't in Texas. I was in the highlands of Cameroon at the Sultan's Palace in the Bamoun Kingdom, and I saw that sucker alive, and I saw him going. And I was sad to see him going, but Lord, he was shaming him for being so tasty. I was like, this is amazing. Like the spicing, the way it was cooked, the long roasting. I mean, anyone who tells you that there's no connection between Africa and barbecue is lying to you. And it's the same culture. It's the Hausa, the Fulani, the people of the savannah, the Sahel, and that the reason why is because the meat you can raise domesticated animals there that will not be affected by the tsetse fly, which could kill them in the forested regions of West Africa. There's only so much. There are certain varieties that are resistant that have been developed over time, but they don't put most of their energy into goats and cows and things. Those things are rare. So to put all this together, the cornbread, the indigenous elements are there too, but they were brought into an African-based culture. And we have to remember that Africans, Europeans, and Native Americans were living side by side across the South and in the middle of the country. And these histories are intertwined. It's really important that people understand that the base center of our conversation may be Africa, the Afro-Atlantic, and Black people. But unlike other people's histories, we don't leave people out. We understand that those people are braided into the flow of our history and the flow of our food as well. Sugarcane is important as well. Sugarcane was raised in parts of Texas. And the sugarcane culture came from the West Indies and ultimately came over from Cape Verde and from West Africa, where sugarcane was being grown for a long time before it was grown on plantations. And so a lot of the things that we enjoy, these confections that are uniquely Southern and Caribbean, all the way from mixed drinks to desserts to sweetened foods, um, are a product of the culture raised in sugarcane and also in Northeast Texas sorghum. Sorghum, by the way, the sorghum that is grown in the South was originally from West Africa. So it was called MP. MP was one of the Zulu names. So they're bringing sorghum varieties from Southeast Africa, from East Africa to the American South very early on. And it was also called guinea corn. And so in Jamaica, they would sing songs like Masana Gamina Guinea Corn, which is a song about the privations of being enslaved in the Americas. And it's so critical to understand that all these things were being grown. They're part of the culture. Pigeon peas, what the Puerto Rican community calls guandules, what they eat in Puerto Rico and Dominican Republic and other spaces in Barbados. Those are being grown in the American South and in Texas too. But they're also in the foraging is so critical because agaritas, the kind of native current, and the cichlids that the same thing as tilapia, live in the Rio Grande River. So the consumption of snakes I saw that in Cameroon. There's so many parallels between the way food is treated. You know, you go in the market in West Africa and they fry fish and they fry chicken right there. And everyone says it's not like ours, it's not coated in anything. It's just the idea that in the market, you know, these are the kind of fresh takeaway foods that people enjoy. And of course, peanuts, goobers. You know, even that word goober and pinder come from Central Africa. And they're not just sweet foods, they're savory foods. And so some of the dishes that got lost on the way, the peanut soups and other things, all those are brought over, filtered through these English, Scots Irish, German, and French lenses and Spanish lenses, and then became part of American food culture. But the cooks remained Black. The food remained Black. You know, Sam Houston, there's this incredible description of his cook and the meals that she used to make. And the fact of the matter is, Black folks made these foods for themselves in their own spaces, not just for white people. We're not centering that. We're centering the fact that Black creativity and Black joy and Black food as an antidote to Black trauma, which is really critical. So to understand that they were hunting the peccaries and the deer, and they were using methods they had used as a people for some 70,000 years as West Africans. You know, the threadfin shad reminds me of the bonga shad that is a part of the anadromous fish species that are in West Africa that are present in the Chesapeake and the Low Country that were also in Texas. So we have all these different elements of food knowledge that were on top of each other, layering, that enabled these people to have an especially powerful approach to food. Last but not least, we talk about Juneteenth and red foods. And I've been telling people that one of the things we might want to look at, I'm not saying it's definitive, but I would say that it is something that we need to look at is the fact that in the Yoruba and Congo cultures, which I told you were some of the big cultures that came at the beginning and very end of the slave trade, particularly through Cuba to Texas. I think Galveston got 36,000 live human beings in 1 year. So these numbers are really there. So they're eating red foods because red is the color of spiritual transformation. Red is the color of Ashe. Red is the color of blood sacrifice. Red is the color of life. Red is the color of the sun. Red is the color of freedom. Red is the color of struggle. Red is this very potent color, and there's absolute reason that red is being used to communicate the idea that freedom has come. Freedom came on June 19th, 1865. And how thrilling and how potent that was for people who had these elements in their culture. I remember I think it's the Levi Jordan house, I believe it is, where they did archaeology and they found a caldero, a pot for Ogun near the house. And it's like, okay, we know, we ancestors, we see you. We understand this, the crystals, the other things that they did to protect themselves in a volatile system. You know, our ancestors were under such pressure, but they gave so much of themselves. And this is why we will continue to advocate and fight for our own rights in our own day, because our ancestors did not suffer this for no reason. This was to give us life and also to uplift and celebrate the ideals of the American project, that every woman, every man, yes, I said woman, I mean woman 3, 4, 5 times, because without our mothers, we are nothing. Without our sisters, we are nothing. Um, it this project is nothing without the idea that we are here to live in freedom and respect and equity and equality. And not to mention the fact that in all of that, we are a multicultural society. We always have been, we always will be as long as we stand. And it's important to acknowledge as responsible members of a multicultural society. Having conversations like these about the origins of our food and talking to each other about the things that our ancestors taught us and left for us as a legacy is a really critical way for us to understand each other as Americans and also get the memo. You are blessed to be in a society and a culture with so many different histories and identities and cultures and dreams and prayers and blessings. You should be happy to be happily contaminated with each other. But part of the responsibility that we have as members of a multicultural society is that we have to do the work. the work of respecting each other, the work of understanding each other. And when we eat each other's food, don't eat that food with just the idea of that's comfort for me. No, that food comes with struggle. The Mexican cuisine is a multi-regional, multi-ethnic, multi-tribal cuisine that goes back 10,000 years. And it has branches in indigenous culture, branches in Spain that ultimately go to North Africa and West Africa with the Moors, that ultimately go to West and Central Africa with the enslaved, that ultimately go to the even East Asian cultures that have been in Mexico. So it's I just putting it out there that we have to have that respect. We can't just eat each other's food and gobble it up and be disrespectful. We have to understand the blood, sweat, and tears that was poured into every single pot, and wish blessings upon the women and the men who innovated those dishes. So at this point, I'm going to go to Q&A because we have about 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we do that. Do you recommend a cookbook for anyone wanting to try recipes that may lend some connection to our African and American ancestry? Absolutely, Natalie. But there's a whole bunch. So get ready to write a lot down. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about The Cooking Gene. The Cooking Gene is my book. It won the James Beard Award for Best Writing and Book of the Year. And it also traces African ancestry through the food. So it really talks about, gives people a blueprint for following that journey, no matter where you come from. And I tried very hard to make sure I got my Kentucky, my Tennessee people, my Arkansas people, my Texas people, my Louisiana people, my Maryland and Virginia people, North Carolina and South Carolina people, Georgia people, Florida people, all of Oklahoma people, all in that book to tell those stories, because I know it's a story of migrations that can be very difficult to do Black genealogy. But when you look at it through the food, it becomes so clear, and the things that you remember your grandparents taught you. Of course, Jessica Harris wrote High on the Hog. That's great. Fred Opie wrote Hog and Hominy, which is great. Tony Tipton Martin's Jubilee, and also Jemima Code, essential. The books by Adrienne Miller. And if you read these books, we're talking about similar variables, but different vehicles. So there will be significant differences, but there are also a thread. Verta Mae Grosvenor, Ntozake Shange, Matthew Rayford just wrote a beautiful cookbook called Breast and Yam, which means bless the food and eat. The vegan cookbooks by Brian Terry. We don't have to look very far for vegivore food being a deep part of African and African Atlantic foodways and African American foodways. So I really encourage you to just pick up those books, get those bibliographies, and just start buying books and reading books, taking books from the library. I'm in a library program, so I guess we should talk about borrowing books and utilizing those resources and having book clubs and cooking your way through these cookbooks. Edna Lewis, of course, fantastic. Leah Chase, fantastic. So we have so many cookbooks. Miss Sally, oh my God, Sally Ann Robinson from South Carolina, fantastic. Cleora's cookbook is from Oklahoma, and she, her family was Texas and Oklahoma. So it's a fantastic resource, and the most beautiful recipes in it. So I really encourage everybody to have a small library of these books and really go into it, and also have conversations with your family about the food. Okay. In reading some of the slave narratives, I've often seen taters mentioned, and it says this food was facing ashes because mentioned with the food. What are taters? Okay, they're sweet potatoes. Yes, you're correct. And cooking in ashes was a cooking method that was brought from West Africa. And it's a way to use the resources around you. Remember, the women did the firewood collecting in West Africa. And so one of the ways, that was, you might walk for a mile collecting stray firewood and bringing it back to the village. So there's a reason why those pots are on 3 stones, so that when the fire dies, when the cooking is really done, you can pull the wood out and reuse it. And those ashes are also being used for roasting cassava, roasting sweet potatoes, roasting yams, roasting other things. And it's a very efficient way to cook because these are very thick-skinned tubers, and you get the benefit of it just being done. In the enslaved community, there was a lack of time. And you had fires going all the time, everywhere, in the field, near the field, in the cabin, etc. So putting the taters in the ashes, the sweet potatoes in the ashes was very important, and also Irish potatoes as well. There were a lot of beautiful vegetables in the community. Enslaved people grew their own vegetables, and what I can say is Slavery, enslavement was not colloquial and was colloquial and discretionary. In other words, there were differences based on where you were, what time you were there, and who was enslaving you, and what liberties you were able to take, and what liberties you took for yourself. And of course, remember, there were also these different cultures around you. So cabbage becomes sauerkraut, right? And the hot sauce is different. The way pepper sauce is made, because the relationship with the Mexican American, Mexican Tex-Mex culture in the area, and the Spanish. The Creole foodways were also a big part of East Texas foodways. We can't forget that. Um, um, those Creole and Cajun foodways are there. When we say Creole and Cajun, we're not talking about the stereotypes there from the 20s. We're talking about the mixture of cultures over time, which was definitely Black, European, and Native. So, I mean, all of that's there. All those pieces are there. And also to understand that like, for example, the kusha, the striped pumpkin, some of you all may know from growing up. The kusha pumpkin was really the pumpkin, not the Connecticut field pumpkin, the Halloween pumpkin. That was the pumpkin they had. And it was, described by Thomas Jefferson and George Washington as like the pumpkin that he said our people are, they meant enslaved property, unfortunately. They said our people, love this thing from the West Indies. They call this pumpkin, the sweet potato pumpkin. And so in Texas, that was the big pumpkin as well. It's really fascinating. There were all these unique foods to Texas as well, like the black persimmon and the peccary and the agaritas, those things. And then these basically these American tilapia living in the thing. Ah, kusha. Wait a minute. Hold on. Somebody's talking some stuff here I need to know about, because yes, yes. So interesting enough, kush kush and kusha and kush or kush, all related. And when I was in Senegal, and also in Nigeria, and then the Hausa call it kusha, and it refers to the mush that you eat. And then in America, the Cajuns and the Creoles call it couscous, which is cornmeal and molasses and milk eaten for breakfast. And the enslaved folks who are coming from the Eastern Seaboard had kush, So yes, kishu, like in the Bible, Daniel, very nice. In the Bible, it's called kishu, the vegetable. So there's all these interesting sort of deeper connections to other food cultures going way, way, way back. And part of the exciting part for me is looking at the intersections that happen before America that continue into the American cultural experiment. Just to see how all those dots and lines intersect is so fascinating, because it's about the enduring stories that endure despite our traumas and issues that we have, and also the ways that we're connected. We don't often emphasize those connections and the words that come through the lines of history. What other questions do we have? I would love to answer more questions. What other questions do we have?
Do we have any other questions out there or comments? I might have one for you. Where does the soul food come from? Why is it called soul food? Do you know? Have you come across that?
Yes, this is actually really, really interesting. So the term soul food is from the 50s and 60s, 60s and 70s mostly. And it refers to, and it's a challenging thing because I know there's a lot of non-black Southerners who are like, well, why same food? Well, okay, you do, but you don't, but you do, but you don't. And it's the same, it's like, for me, for example, saying Ashkenazi Jewish food from Eastern Europe is the same food as Eastern European food. It is, but it isn't, but it is, but maybe, but it sort of, Yes, there are these deep similarities, these deep connections, right? But they're based on contact and culture. To me, soul food is the memory cuisine of the great grandchildren and great great grandchildren of the enslaved. Those people who are making the Great Migration, who are going from Texas to LA and Oakland, who are going from Mississippi to Chicago, who are going from South Carolina to New York. You know, they're basically immigrants. They're basically immigrants, and to see other people do their culture, they're doing their culture, which is from the rural South. And then they're also coming in contact with Caribbean immigrants as well. So there's these layers of creating identity. Soul food to me, you know, I said in High on the Hog that to me, soul food is more than just that memory cuisine. It's this transcendental, you know, cuisine. It's based on feelings in the heart. You know, soul food isn't a cuisine of technique. It's a cuisine of feelings, a cuisine of emotion. It's a cuisine of like the hospitality that you give to other people and the feeling of coming home, the feeling of having a home, the feeling of being nourished, not just by nostalgia, but by the actual transfer of energy from person to person, of love, of encouragement, of hope, of resistance. So to me, all those different pieces are really a part of what soul food is. And I don't think of soul food as a canon. So for example, some people might be like, I gotta have sweet potato pie and I gotta have collard greens and I gotta have, you know, mustard greens and turnip greens and I gotta have, you know, rice and gravy and I gotta have fried pork chops. I gotta have fried chicken. Well, that's part of it. That's not all of it. To me, soul food is a construct. It's not a canon. It's not a set menu. Even though to a lot of people, unfortunately, soul food can only be one thing and one thing only. And if you know, if you you know, go outside of it, but even in terms of soul food, there's these different varieties of food. You know, for example, I don't do catfish and spaghetti because the hell with that. I never heard no catfish and spaghetti. But if you talk you from Chicago and from, you know, Memphis or from Detroit, that's what they do. Whereas to me, somebody who has a Carolina heritage, eating rice like all the time is a thing. And when I went to Sierra Leone and Senegal, and that's all they have is rice, I was happy because I was like, yeah, that's what we do. And they're like, yes, you're one of us. You're part of our family. But of course, a lot of these foods have gone across cultures. So people will take the fried chicken and the rice and the okra and black eyed peas, and they may be German, part Irish, Mexican, all these other cultures. They may do unique things with those foods and expand the canon and expand the construct of soul food. So I just think it's about having an open mind. I think it's about having a real love for these foods, um, to see them from the earth. I mean, Texas is a huge farming place, and people, you know, people who are from Texas will often talk to me about going to their grandparents' gardens, remembering the garden has a kid, the thrill of having the watermelons in June and July, the thrill of the fresh peas as opposed to just dried peas. Most Americans only know about dried peas, but if you eat fresh black eyed peas and gray crowders and purple holes, you will know that the whole different experience. There's a reason we have a Texas caviar because it's you know, it's glorious. It's about having those tomatoes and onions and garlic and jalapenos and all this stuff in one thing. Trust me, that to me, soul food is bigger than what the fast food companies and restaurants have made out to be. Soul food is really a labor of love. And if you ever go to somebody's house for a good Sunday dinner, you know where that love comes from.
We've actually had quite a few more questions come in. Um, how did you start with your research?
Um, as when I was very young, like the idea that um I wanted to know what my grandparents were doing, what my parents meant, all these stories and things and words I'd heard around me. I have no explanation for them. And it was just like I needed to know. So I just started reading everything I could and watching cooking shows. In fact, one of the cooking shows that really inspired me was Nellie Dupree's, you know, New Southern Cooking. And what's cool about that is that now she's a friend and mentor of mine, and I've been to her house and stayed there and cooked with her. So it's like it's these awesome opportunities, these journeys that I've had have been really really fruitful for me. And you read, you work, you cook at historical sites. This week coming, I'm going to be at Colonial Williamsburg for the entire week, doing historic cooking, doing demonstrations, doing gardening, talking to people, teaching people. So for me, that's a big part of the research.
There's actually one that ties in with that. How has your historical reenactment informed your understanding or smoked meats and barbecue?
So I actually did a really great program at the French Legation Museum in Austin some time ago, and Daniel Vaughn from Texas Monthly was there, and what we wanted to do was talk about revive some of the descriptions of barbecue we had in the WP narratives from Texas and other places. So we did the whole thing. We dug a hole. We took mesquite. We took hickory. We took oak. We took live oak. We took pecan wood. Everything we could find. We built a fire, and then we actually cooked a shoat in the hole over the sticks, the way they did, 2 centuries ago, and people loved it. And so I've done a lot of. I've done one in Kentucky with lamb. I've done a lot in Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina with beef and pork and other things and chickens. And so just to show people and goat, just to show people how the original barbecue came to be, you know, and especially in Texas. I mean, it was a sold out thing. They loved it. Tony Tipton Martin, who used to live in Austin, was there, and she did her pie thing the day before. That was fantastic. Yeah, there's no pecan pie without us either, because this facts. I see a question about favorite food. Favorite food. Oh my God, barbecue and fried chicken are my favorite foods, honestly, from our heritage. But also, I think really good collard greens, which I have to make myself. I don't trust other people's collard greens, and I don't trust everybody's potato salad. Ancient Southern proverb: "Who made the salad? Who made the potato salad?" That's the bottom line. Okra has been interesting because I didn't grow up loving okra and black eyed peas, but now I eat them um, when they're in season, and I eat them differently. I don't like slimy okra. I like fresh okra. So as soon as I plant my okra and the pods I start snapping them off, put them in the pot. You know, favorite recipes found in Texas. Y'all don't want me to answer. It's gonna be basic and stupid. So I'll be real. Since Jennifer is my new friend, I'll be real with you. Jennifer, what are those beans they have, like especially in Austin and like Tex-Mex, rancho beans?
Oh yeah, like
Oh, yeah, the thing you eat on the side. Oh my God, those are good. But prickly pear margaritas are my favorite Texas
mm,
thing. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, y'all. I know that's basic. Um, the tracing the South Carolina African American dishes to Africa. That's so easy. It's so easy because South Carolina has Hop and John, right? Hop and John was spread across the South, but in South Carolina and Georgia, the coastal Georgia, they make them with red field peas, not just black eyed peas. And in Senegal, you have the dish called chebu nyebe. Cheb means rice, um, and nyebe means black eyed peas or cow peas. That's one. Red rice and jollof rice. We already talked about that. But also things like the limping Susan, which is in Africa, which is okra and rice. They cook the okra on top of the rice and steam it at the same time. Then they mix it. There's also any number of things you might call okra soup or gumbo. Subakanja in Senegal is okra soup. And in some parts of coastal Gambia and Senegal and Guinea-Bissau, Guinea and Sierra Leone, they throw in any shellfish, any crab they can find in it, into the pot. Also, in Africa, suya and chichinga and DB are native forms of barbecue. So in Senegal, DB can be chicken, can be lamb, can be goat, can be beef. They don't eat pork there because they're mostly Muslim, and even fish sometimes. And what they do is they cook it for hours over wood fire. And it's your job to go to the French bread store to get your French bread so you can sop up. And look, I didn't even think about that till I went to West Africa. I was like, the only proper way to eat a biscuit is to sop, right? But then I was like in Ghana, and I was noticing that with fufu, you take your right hand, you take like the cornbread or the fufu and whatever, and you take it and the sauce of the soup, and you go like that. And I was like, oh my God, I've been doing this my whole life. I didn't realize, where that came from, where that whole idea of, to sop and to move use that starch to transmit that soup or that stew to your mouth. That whole story on that gravy. This one's really important. I know we're running out of time, Jennifer, so I'm gonna probably make this the last one. Where do you draw the line between enjoying culture's food and appropriating culture's food? That is fantastic. Does it simply boil down to attribution, appreciation? it's bigger than that. I remember Chris Shepard from Houston told me that his restaurants, he would encourage people to go eat the food of people who inspired him. And I think it's so important to label our food inspired by, not just, not just of that food. You're not making sushi. You're making food that's inspired by. Unless you were trained in, if you're trained in Japan and being a sushi master or trained somewhere else, that's cool. You've done the work. But also, you're also a guest in someone else's space. And I think that it's a little bit too late to say someone can make or can't make another person's food, but it's never too late to have respect. It's never too late to respect boundaries. It's never, and also understand that cultural appropriation isn't just based on um, racial categories, ethnicity. It's also based on gender. I mean, how many dudes have run around talking about I make comfort food from a food truck? Well, you didn't do it with 10 kids at your daggone sleeve talking about ma, like mothers have done since the beginning of time. So therefore, no, no, sir. You are not actually making that the real comfort food that comes from can only come from our sisters, our mothers, our grandmothers, our cousins, our friends. So it's so I say to people, the opposite of cultural appropriation is cultural diffusion, sharing culture in a healthy multicultural society. The opposite of cultural appropriation is having respect and acknowledging origins. The opposite of cultural appropriation is sharing with our neighbors and learning and listening to them and having an open mind, open heart. And knowing that cultural appropriation is about using the power of the platform and the privilege to exploit, which is not uncommon in our world, in our country, unfortunately. So the opposite of that is making sure that people have their own platform and privilege and power to promote their culture and their food space. I really have appreciated this, Jennifer, and I'm so grateful to everybody who was here. The enthusiasm of our charo beans. That's what charo beans, not rancho beans.
Thank you. I couldn't
Charo
think of it
beans.
either. They're
I'm so
good.
sorry.
I do have to know this one last thing though. Preferred method of eating grits, sweet, savory with fish or ham or bacon. I have to know. I'm sorry. I'm running
I
you over.
Okay, Jennifer. I am not a big grits person,
Neither
but
am I.
I will say this. I will say this. There is a reason and a historical reason culture for putting sugar in it. For example, but I know I would not do that. So, for example, when I was in Senegal, they eat something called cheddar in the morning. Cheddar is basically like grits, like posho inside of the foods from East Africa, but they put sugar in them. And also gari in Ghana, like if you eat it cold, it's cassava grits, and they like will cook them and then leave it cold, and they put sugar in them. I
Mhm.
So when I looked at that, I was like, well, we aren't that far off. But for me, grits, and from an indigenous perspective, are just a starchy food, and for some people, savory food. So, most of my grits have, I'm not a big grits eater, but when I do eat them with other things, like grits and griots, amazing from Creole, Louisiana,
Mhm.
amazing food. It's basically any kind of meat chop, and you make a gravy with tomatoes and onions and garlic and stuff, and eat on top of grits, amazing. Or, you have your little, cheese grits sometimes. Those can be fun. We made a cheese grits, guys, last thing. Here's an idea. You know how you have that the little um Swiss chopped cheese that you get at the store with the herbs and the garlic in it,
Mhm. Yeah.
Worcester cheese and something like that. Y'all, do yourself a favor. Get you some real grits, not them instant nonsense. Take you some real grits and some butter and some of that cheese. Throw that mess in there, like Worcester cheese with the garlic and the herb in it. Change your life. The chops change your life. I'm telling you, it's good stuff. Hey,
Sounds good.
thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you for joining us. And everybody, his books are available at the library. And also if you go to the website and look at this, you can see a link to his website. So I know someone was asking about possible classes, but if you go on his website, you can see all of his activities and get more information about Michael Twitty. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you were able to join us tonight.
Yes, thank you so much. Y'all have a good one now.